The dragon called Shadowfang was dying, and he knew it. His massive body stretched across what used to be the main plaza of Colony 7, a human settlement on the outer edge of known space. 3 days ago, this place had been alive with markets, laughing children, and the smell of food from a dozen different Earth cultures. Now it was just dust, broken concrete, and the scorch marks from his own desperate fire. His scales, which should have gleamed like polished midnight under the alien sun, were cracked and fading to a dull gray. Blue blood seeped from between them, the bioluminescent fluid that powered his ancient body slowly draining away into the thirsty ground. Each breath felt like dragging broken glass through his chest. He'd burned through 2,000 years of stored solar energy in just 72 hours, and there was nothing left. Above him, the sky was filled with the roar of engines. Evacuation ships, big and small, were punching through the atmosphere in streams of fire and desperation. Some were proper colony transports, sleek and silver. Others were cargo haulers, mining rigs, even personal shuttles, all overloaded with twice the passengers they were designed to carry. Every single one was running for their lives. Shadowfang had bought them this time. While humanity packed up everything they could carry and said goodbye to another world, he had stood between them and the Devourers. That's what people called the enemy, though their real name was something humans couldn't pronounce. They were silicon-based creatures that moved like a living wave of crystal and consumed everything organic in their path, converting it into more of themselves. Beautiful and absolutely terrifying. The dragon had fought them at the colony's edge, then at the outer settlements, then at the walls of the city itself. His fire had turned sand into glass and glass into vapor. He'd collapsed buildings to create barriers, used his massive tail to crush their advance forces, and roared defiance until his throat bled. And it had worked. The humans had gotten away. All except the dragon himself. He was simply too big. A dragon wasn't like the smaller creatures that hitched rides on starships. He was a starship, in a way. His body was designed to survive the void of space, to store energy from stars, to cross the galaxy with human partners riding in special chambers along his spine. But that same size meant no evacuation vessel could carry him. The cargo holds weren't big enough. The loading ramps would collapse under his weight. He'd made peace with it, mostly. 2,000 years was a good run. He'd seen things most beings never would. He'd carried 17 different human partners across the stars, watched their children grow, attended their funerals. He'd seen Earth itself, back before the expansion, a little blue marble that somehow produced the most stubborn, creative, impossible species in the galaxy. The other dragons had already gone, carrying their human partners to safety. He didn't blame them. This was the reality of war. Sometimes the math was simple and cruel. One life, even a dragon's life, wasn't worth risking a ship full of refugees. He understood. He even agreed. But understanding didn't make dying alone any easier. The last few ships were clearing the atmosphere now, their engines just bright dots against the darkening sky. Soon the Devourers would come. He could already see them on the horizon, a glittering line that caught the red light of the setting sun. They moved like water, flowing over and around obstacles, relentless and patient. They knew he was spent. They could wait. Shadowfang closed his eyes, just for a moment. He was so tired. Maybe he could rest, just a little, before the end came. That's when he heard the footsteps. They were small, light, crunching on the broken pavement. A human, and a young one from the sound of it. The dragon's eyes snapped open, focusing on a figure climbing over the rubble toward him. A boy. Maybe 12 years old, skinny, with dark hair sticking up in odd directions and a backpack that looked too big for his shoulders. He was carrying something in his hands. A canteen. Kid, Shadowfang's voice came out as a low rumble that shook pebbles on the ground. What are you doing here? The ships are leaving. I know, the boy said, still walking closer. His name was Danny, though the dragon didn't know that yet. But you looked thirsty. Of all the things Shadowfang had expected, that wasn't one of them. The enemy is coming. You need to go. Now. Yeah, I saw them, Danny said, like he was talking about her approaching rainstorm instead of certain death. He climbed up onto a chunk of broken wall to get closer to the dragon's head. But my mom always said nobody should have to be alone when things get bad. And you saved all of us, so. He unscrewed the canteen and held it up toward Shadowfang's mouth. The dragon stared at this impossible child, this stubborn little human who should have been safe on a ship heading away from here. In 2,000 years, through 17 partners, through countless battles and adventures, no one had ever stayed when death was certain. Partners were supposed to survive. That was the whole point. Why? The word came out barely as a whisper. Danny shrugged, like it was obvious. Because it's the right thing to do. Shadowfang extended his massive tongue, letting a few drops from the canteen fall onto it. The water was cool and clean, filtered through one of those fancy recycler systems that could purify anything. It wasn't nearly enough to matter for a creature his size, like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon, but somehow it mattered more than anything had in a very long time. Danny hopped down from the wall and sat himself right next to the dragon's front leg, which was about as thick as an old earth oak tree. He set his backpack down and pulled out a protein bar, unwrapping it like they had all the time in the world. The devourers were maybe 15 minutes away now, their crystalline bodies catching the dying light and throwing it back in sharp, cutting angles. You probably think I'm crazy, Danny said around a mouthful of food. The thought crossed my mind, Shadowfang admitted. His voice was still weak, but talking to the boy seemed to help somehow. Where are your parents? On the transport ship Destiny. They think I'm on the medical frigate with my broken arm. He held up his left arm, which was wrapped in a healing cast. I told them I needed to use the bathroom before boarding. Then I just didn't board. They'll be worried sick. Yeah, probably, Danny said, and there was guilt in his voice. But they'll understand eventually. I hope. My dad always told me stories about the old days, back on Earth, about how people used to stick together. He said that's what made humans special, you know? Not that we're the smartest or the strongest, but that we don't leave people behind when it matters. The dragon watched the boy with his ancient golden eyes. That's a nice idea. Not always practical, though. Maybe not, Danny agreed. He pulled out a small tablet from his backpack, the screen cracked but still working. But my dad also said that being human means doing stuff even when it's not practical. Especially then. He tapped at the tablet, pulling up pictures. This is my mom. She's a botanist, grows food in the hydroponic gardens. She sings while she works, but she's really, really bad at it. Like, plants might die bad. He grinned at the memory. And this is my dad. He's a maintenance tech, fixes the climate controls and stuff. He tells the worst jokes. Like, so bad you laugh just because they're terrible. Danny kept scrolling, talking about his life like they were sitting in a cafe instead of waiting for death. This is my friend Kevin. He can burp the alphabet, which is gross but also kind of impressive. And this is my teacher, Mrs. Patterson. She made us do this whole project on dragon biology, which is actually how I learned about you guys. Oh? Shadowfang found himself genuinely curious. What did you learn? Well, that you can survive in space, which is insane. And that you convert solar radiation into plasma or something. I didn't totally understand that part. But the coolest thing was that dragons don't actually need humans. Like, at all. You're completely self-sufficient. That's true, Shadowfang said quietly. So why do you partner with us? Mrs. Patterson said it was for navigation and repairs, but that seemed like a dumb answer. You guys have been flying through space for millions of years. You obviously know how to get around. The dragon was silent for a moment, watching the devourers creep closer. They were maybe 10 minutes away now. Your teacher was giving you the official answer. The one that makes sense to politicians and administrators. What's the real answer? Because you make life worth living, Shadowfang said simply. Dragons can survive anything. We're nearly immortal, can cross entire galaxies, can fight off almost any threat. But surviving isn't the same as living. Humans taught us the difference. Danny looked up at him, the tablet forgotten in his lap. How? You find joy in the smallest things. A good meal. A terrible joke. A song sung badly in a garden. You create meaning where there isn't any. You care about each other even when it doesn't make sense to care. The dragon's voice grew stronger as he spoke. Dragons hoard, you know. That part of your legends is true. But we don't hoard gold or jewels. We hoard moments. Every laugh, every story, every time a partner shared something precious with us. That's our real treasure. The boy was quiet, processing this. Then he pulled something else from his backpack, a small, battered harmonica. My grandpa gave me this before he died. He said it was made on actual Earth, like hundreds of years ago. I'm not very good at it yet, but... He held it up. Want to hear? Very much, Shadowfang said. Danny put the harmonica to his lips and began to play. The tune was simple, a little rough around the edges, some kind of folk song about rivers and home. The notes drifted across the ruined plaza, mixing with the distant chiming sound of the approaching devourers. And something impossible began to happen. The music seemed to resonate inside Shadowfang's chest, vibrating in his core where his solar furnace had gone cold and dead. It was just a simple melody played by a child who was still learning, but it touched something ancient in the dragon's biology, something that had been sleeping for millions of years, waiting for exactly this moment. A moment when someone valued him more than they valued their own survival. The dragon's chest began to warm. At first, Shadowfang thought it was just his imagination, some kind of dying hallucination brought on by energy depletion and blood loss. But no, the warmth was real. It started deep in his chest cavity, right where his solar furnace sat, the biological reactor that had been cold and empty for days now. It felt like someone had lit a tiny candle in a dark room. Danny kept playing, his eyes closed, completely focused on the simple melody. He had no idea what was happening. The warmth in Shadowfang's chest grew stronger, spreading outward in waves. It wasn't the familiar heat of solar energy conversion, the process he'd used for 2,000 years. This was different. Older. Something coded into dragon DNA from before they'd ever left their home world, before they'd ever met humans, before they'd become the starfaring creatures everyone knew. Danny, Shadowfang said, his voice suddenly steadier than it had been in days. You need to run. Right now. The boy stopped playing and looked up at him. What? Why? Because something is happening to me, and I don't know if it's safe. The dragon could feel his hearts, all three of them, starting to beat faster. His blood, which had been sluggish and cold, began pumping with renewed vigor. Please, just go. No, Danny said stubbornly, crossing his arms. I told you already. I'm staying. Danny, I'm serious. So am I. The boy's jaw was set in that particular way humans got when they'd made up their minds and wouldn't budge. Shadowfang had seen it 1,000 times before in his partners. Whatever's happening, we face it together. That's how this works, right? Before the dragon could argue further, his chest erupted with light. Not the orange-red glow of his normal fire, but a brilliant blue-white radiance that lit up the entire plaza like a second sun. Danny stumbled backward, shielding his eyes, but he didn't run. The light was coming from between Shadowfang's scales, shining through the cracks where his old armor had been damaged. But as he watched in amazement, those cracked scales began to fall away, not from injury but from something new growing underneath. The new scales were unlike anything he'd ever seen on a dragon before. They looked like compressed starlight, shimmering with colors that didn't quite exist in normal space, shifting between blue and white and silver. The transformation spread from his chest outward, each old scale cracking and falling away to reveal the new growth beneath. It should have been painful, like molting or shedding skin, but instead it felt incredible. Shadowfang felt strength returning to muscles that had been weak and failing. His wings, which had been torn and barely functional, began to regenerate, the damaged membrane filling in with tissue that gleamed like mother of pearl. What's happening to you? Danny asked, his voice full of wonder rather than fear. I don't know, Shadowfang admitted, watching his own body transform. I've heard legends, old stories passed down from the ancient dragons, about something called a second ignition. But I always thought they were just myths, fairy tales we told to comfort dying elders. What's a second ignition? The dragon flexed his claws experimentally. They were sharper now, stronger, made of something that looked more like solidified energy than normal keratin. The legends say it's a rebirth, a transformation that happens when a dragon is at the point of death but finds a reason to live that's stronger than the reason to die. It requires. He paused, looking down at the boy who had refused to abandon him. It requires being valued by someone who puts your life above their own. Danny's eyes went wide. You mean? I did this. I think we did this, Shadowfang corrected. Together. The transformation was accelerating now. The dragon's entire body was covered in the new scales, and he could feel power building inside him like nothing he'd experienced before. His solar furnace wasn't just restarting, it was upgrading, restructuring itself at the molecular level. Where before he could store solar energy, now he could feel himself tapping into something deeper, more fundamental. The power of the stars themselves, not just their light but their very essence. He tried to stand and found it surprisingly easy. His legs, which had barely been able to support his weight minutes ago, now lifted his massive bulk without strain. His wings unfurled, stretching nearly a kilometer from tip to tip, each membrane glowing with that same otherworldly light. The Devourers had gotten closer during the transformation. They were less than 500 meters away now, a glittering wall of crystalline death that filled the horizon. Their bodies chimed and sang as they moved, a sound that was beautiful and horrible at the same time. It was the sound of silicon grinding against silicon, of molecular structures being torn apart and reformed. They sensed something had changed. The front line of their advance slowed, hesitated. In all their consumption of 40 worlds, they'd never encountered anything like this. Shadowfang looked down at Danny, who was staring up at him with a mixture of awe and excitement. "You might want to cover your ears," the dragon said. "Why?" "Because I'm about to get very, very loud." The dragon drew in a breath, and it felt like inhaling the solar wind itself. His lungs filled with superheated plasma, but not the normal kind. This was stellar material, the stuff that burned at the core of suns. He could feel it building in his throat, in his fire glands, pressurizing to levels that should have been impossible. And then Shadowfang roared. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a physical force that rippled through the air, shattering what remained of the nearby building's windows and sending shockwaves across the ground. But more than that, it was a declaration. A statement to the universe that he was not dying quietly. That humanity's stubbornness and refusal to give up had infected him, changed him, made him into something new. The Devourers' chiming became discordant, almost panicked. They had consumed worlds, defeated armies, overwhelmed defenses that should have been impenetrable. But they had never faced a dragon reborn. And they had never faced the kind of stubborn human love that would sit beside a dying friend and play a harmonica while the world ended. Shadowfang's wings caught the air, and for the first time in 3 days, he flew. The moment Shadowfang's wings caught the air, Danny felt the wind blast across the plaza like a hurricane. Dust and debris swirled around him as the massive dragon launched himself skyward, his new scales catching the last light of the setting sun and throwing it back in 1,000 different colors. The boy had to grab onto a piece of broken concrete to keep from being blown over, but he couldn't stop grinning. "Go get him," he shouted, though his voice was lost in the roar of wind and wings. Shadowfang climbed higher, feeling the atmosphere thin around him. His body remembered this, the joy of flight, but everything felt different now. Stronger. Faster. He banked hard to the right, testing his new wings, and found he could turn on a fraction of the radius he used to need. The new membrane was tougher, more responsive, like the difference between flying with fabric wings versus flying with pure energy. Below him, the Devourers had stopped their advance entirely. Their crystalline structures were pulsing with different colors now, probably some form of communication. Danny had mentioned in his school report that scientists thought the Devourers had a hive mind, that each individual crystal was like a brain cell in a massive distributed intelligence. If that was true, then right now that intelligence was probably trying to figure out what the hell it was looking at. Shadowfang decided to give them a demonstration. He dove, pulling his wings tight against his body, accelerating toward the ground at speeds that would have torn apart his old body. The new scales didn't even heat up from the friction. He opened his mouth, felt the stellar fire building in his throat, and unleashed it at the front line of the Devourers. The fire that erupted from his jaws wasn't orange or red or even blue. It was white, so bright it turned the twilight into noon. The temperature was beyond anything he'd produced before, matching the core of a sun, somewhere around 15 million degrees. Where it touched the Devourers, they didn't melt or burn. They simply ceased to exist, their silicon matrices unable to maintain cohesion in that kind of heat. They sublimated, going from solid directly to gas, then to plasma, then to nothing at all. A section of the crystalline army 300 meters wide just vanished. The remaining Devourers reacted immediately, trying to scatter, to spread out and make themselves harder to hit. But Shadowfang had spent 2,000 years in combat. He knew every tactical trick, every evasion pattern. He banked left, strafed another section of their line, then pulled up and came around for another pass. Each burst of his new fire eliminated another chunk of the enemy force. But something else was happening, something even more important than the battle in front of him. Shadowfang could feel it through the bond, that mysterious connection that linked all dragons across space and time. It was like a spider web made of light, stretching across the galaxy, and he could sense every other dragon touching that web. And right now, many of them were dying. On 16 other worlds, dragons had made the same choice he had. They'd stayed behind to buy time for evacuations, burned through their energy reserves, and now lay waiting for death. He could feel their resignation, their acceptance. They'd lived good lives. They'd served well. This was just the price of war. But Shadowfang knew something they didn't. He knew about second ignitions. He knew about stubborn human children who brought water to dying dragons. He reached out through the bond, not with words but with pure emotion and experience. He showed them what had happened to him. The boy. The harmonica. The transformation. And most importantly, the feeling that had triggered it all, that moment when he realized someone valued him more than they valued their own survival. The response was immediate. Across 16 worlds, dragons began to remember. They remembered their human partners, the ones who'd laughed with them and cried with them and shared their lives. They remembered the mechanics who'd worked double shifts to keep them healthy. The navigators who'd helped them find their way through impossible storms. The children who'd brought them drawings and asked endless questions about the stars. And as they remembered, their bodies began to change. On an ice world called Novaya Zemlya, a dragon named Stormwing felt warmth return to her chest. Her partner, a grizzled pilot named Jack, had refused evacuation, choosing instead to stay in the command center and coordinate the defense until the last civilian ship escaped. When he saw his dragon beginning to glow, he understood immediately. On a jungle planet called Verde, a young dragon barely 200 years old felt the change begin. His partner, a medical officer named Lisa, had been treating wounded refugees and missed her own evacuation window. She'd simply shrugged and kept working, knowing her dragon needed time to rest. On a desert world, in a frozen colony, on a water planet covered in storms, the pattern repeated. Humans choosing to stay. Dragons beginning to glow. The second ignition spreading like wildfire through the bond. Back on Colony 7, Danny watched the sky light up with Shadowfang's fire. The Devourers were in full retreat now, their advance broken, their hive mind probably screaming with confusion and something that might have been fear. In 40 worlds, they'd never faced real resistance. They'd certainly never faced something that could hurt them this badly. But then something even more spectacular happened. The sky began to fill with light, but not from Shadowfang's fire. Portals were opening, tears in space itself, the way dragons traveled when they needed to cross distances faster than normal flight. And through those portals came other dragons, dozens of them, all glowing with the same stellar radiance that Shadowfang had. They emerged like shooting stars, dragons of every color and size, all transformed, all reborn. And they were angry. 4 years they'd been pushed back, forced to retreat, watching worlds fall to the crystalline tide. Not anymore. The counterattack began. Stormwing came through first, her ice-blue scales now shimmering like captured northern lights. She released a blast of fire that flash-froze a section of Devourers, then shattered them with her tail. Right behind her came Verde's young dragon, his green scales turned to emerald starlight, burning through the enemy with the enthusiasm of youth combined with the power of rebirth. More kept coming. Dragons that had been dying minutes ago, now alive and furious and ready to turn the tide. The Devourers tried to reform their lines, to mount a counterattack, but it was useless. They were facing an enemy that operated on love and stubbornness and the absolute human refusal to accept defeat. Within an hour, Colony 7 was clear. The Devourers that weren't destroyed had retreated into the wastes, and the dragons were hunting them down in teams, making sure none remained. Shadowfang landed back in the plaza where Danny waited, his massive form touching down so gently he barely disturbed the dust. The boy ran up to him, still grinning like an idiot. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Danny practically shouted. "That," Shadowfang said, his voice warm with affection and amusement, "was all because you wouldn't leave." The plaza had gone quiet except for the sound of distant dragon wings and the settling of dust. Danny stood there looking up at Shadowfang, who seemed even more massive now with his new scales gleaming in the starlight. The boy's backpack was still sitting where he'd left it, his harmonica tucked safely inside, and somehow the normalcy of those objects felt strange against everything that had just happened. "So," Danny said, breaking the silence with a slightly nervous laugh, "I guess you're not dying anymore." "No," Shadowfang agreed, lowering his enormous head until one golden eye was level with the boy. "Thanks to you, I'm very much not dying. In fact, I feel better than I have in centuries." "That's good. That's really good." Danny kicked at a pebble, suddenly unsure of himself. "My parents are probably losing their minds right now. The ships will have noticed what happened. They'll be sending messages, trying to figure out what's going on." "They'll be coming back," Shadowfang confirmed. "I can already sense ships turning around. The evacuation fleet received word that Colony 7 is secure." He paused, studying the boy carefully. "You're going to be in considerable trouble, you know." "Yeah, I figured." Danny grimaced. "My mom's going to ground me until I'm 30. And my dad's going to give me that disappointed look, which is somehow worse than yelling." "But you did it anyway." "Well, yeah. I couldn't just leave you here alone." The boy looked up, meeting the dragon's massive eye without flinching. "That wouldn't have been right." Shadowfang was quiet for a long moment, and Danny started to worry he'd said something wrong. But then the dragon spoke, his voice softer than before, almost gentle. "In 2,000 years, I've had 17 partners. Good people, all of them. Brave, skilled, dedicated. We flew together, fought together, explored the unknown together. But not one of them, not a single one, would have done what you did today. Really? Really? They would have followed orders, gotten on those ships, survived to fight another day. That's what they were trained to do. It's the smart choice, the logical choice. The dragon's eye seemed to glow a bit brighter. But you're 12 years old and you made a choice that wasn't smart or logical. You made a choice that was simply human. Danny felt his cheeks getting warm. I just did what felt right. Exactly. Shadowfang lifted his head slightly, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Do you know what happens now? With me, I mean. With this transformation. You get to keep being awesome and breathing fire. That got a rumbling laugh from the dragon, a sound like distant thunder but warm. Yes, that too. But there's more. A dragon who undergoes a second ignition essentially becomes a new being. Same memories, same personality, but everything else changes. New body, new capabilities, new energy signature. According to the old traditions, that means I need a new partner. Danny's heart skipped a beat. A new partner? Someone to bond with, to share the adventures ahead. Because make no mistake, Danny, there will be adventures. The Devourers are retreating now, but they won't give up. They'll regroup, adapt, come back stronger. And we'll need to be ready. All of us, humans and dragons together. Shadowfang lowered his head again, bringing his eye close to the boy. I know you're young. Normally, dragon partners aren't chosen until they're at least 18, sometimes older. There's training involved, physical conditioning, studying xenobiology and navigation and a dozen other subjects. But. Danny could hear the but coming. But you've already proven something that can't be taught in any classroom. You proved you understand what the bond really means. Not duty or obligation or tactical advantage, but genuine connection. Caring about someone even when it costs you everything. The dragon's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Danny, would you consider bonding with me? Being my partner as we face whatever comes next. The boy's mind was racing. Partner with a dragon. Him. A 12-year-old kid who was barely passing his math classes and still got scared during thunderstorms. It was insane. His parents would never allow it. There were probably laws against it. He was too young, too unprepared, too everything. Yes, he heard himself say. Absolutely yes. You don't want to think about it. I've been thinking about it since I decided to stay, Danny admitted. I mean, I didn't know about the whole rebirth thing or the second ignition or any of that. I just knew I couldn't leave you. And now, if you're asking if I want to keep not leaving you, then yeah. Obviously. 100% yes. Shadowfang made a sound that might have been a sigh or might have been a laugh. Your parents really are going to kill me. Probably, Danny agreed cheerfully. But we'll face that together too, right? That's how this works. That's exactly how this works. The bonding ceremony itself was simple. No fancy words or elaborate rituals, just the dragon lowering his head and Danny placing both hands on the smooth scales of his snout. There was a moment when nothing seemed to happen, and then suddenly Danny felt it, a warmth spreading through his chest, a connection forming that was deeper than words or thoughts. It was like gaining a new sense he didn't know was possible, an awareness of the dragon's presence that would stay with him no matter how far apart they were. Through the bond, he could feel Shadowfang's emotions. Relief, joy, gratitude, and underneath it all, a fierce protective instinct that was almost overwhelming. This dragon would die for him, Danny realized. Would burn stars and fight impossible battles and face any danger to keep him safe. And the crazy thing was, Danny felt exactly the same way. Wow, he breathed. Is it always like this? Always, Shadowfang confirmed. Welcome to the bond, partner. Above them, the sky was filling with returning ships. The evacuation fleet had gotten word that the threat was gone, that Colony 7 was secure, and they were coming home. Somewhere up there, Danny's parents were probably having heart attacks when they realized which ship he wasn't on. We should probably figure out what to tell them, Danny said. How about the truth? You saved my life, I saved the colony, and now we're partners. Simple. You've never met my mom, have you? Nothing is simple with her. Shadowfang laughed again, that rumbling thunder sound. Then I suppose I'll have to meet her properly. And your father. And probably a whole lot of very angry colony administrators who are going to want to know why a 12-year-old is bonded to a dragon. Think they'll try to break the bond?
They can try.
But dragon bonds, once formed, are unbreakable. They'd have better luck moving a planet. The dragon shifted his position, his starlight scales catching the glow from the landing lights of the approaching ships. Besides, I have a feeling you're going to be somewhat famous after this. The boy who stayed behind. The child who triggered a second ignition and changed the course of the war. They'll write stories about you. Danny groaned. Great. I'm going to be that kid forever, aren't I? Afraid so, partner. The first ship touched down at the far end of the plaza, and Danny could see people pouring out, running toward them. He recognized his mom's purple jacket even from this distance. She was going to hug him and yell at him and probably cry, maybe all at the same time. Ready? Shadowfang asked. Danny took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and nodded. Together? Always together, the dragon confirmed. From now until the stars go cold. And as Danny's mother reached him and pulled him into the tightest hug of his life, as his father stood there with tears streaming down his face, as the other colonists gathered around in wonder and disbelief, the boy and his dragon faced it all side by side. Just like they would face everything else that came their way. Together.